Yeah, it's just not.
Now I'm going to move this over to the screen. Where did my Adobe go? Okay.
Oh.
All right. We're ready to get started. So I've asked Nick Simeone, who's one of our master's students, to introduce our speaker today. Before he does, I wanted to say a word about what's coming up. So after this week, the next seminar we're going to have is going to be with Dr. Tess Thompson from Virginia Tech. And that will be 2 weeks from today. And her topic will be, do existing Maryland stormwater regulations protect channel stability, understanding the origin, history, and effects of stormwater regulations on the physical integrity of headwater streams. So same time, same place, Tess will be here in person, and hopefully we'll have worked out some of the technical bugs so we don't have some of the same issues that we're dealing with right now. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Nick to introduce our speaker, and then we'll let Mark take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Simeone. Some of you may know me. I'm a GES grad student here at UMBC. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Stewart. He leads the climate change program at the Maryland Department of the Environment. And he and his team are responsible for developing and implementing policies to achieve the most ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals of any state in the nation. His team recently released Maryland's Climate Pollution Reduction Plan to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions 60% by 2031 and set the state on a path to achieve net zero emissions by 2045. Mark's team is also responsible for developing new regulations, conducting Maryland's official greenhouse gas emissions inventory, staffing the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, and running other stakeholder processes. Before joining MBE, he worked for 14 years on sustainability and climate change issues at the University of Maryland. He was honored to be nominated by the Obama administration for the White House Champions of Change Award. Mark lives in Silver Spring, Maryland, conveniently located near breweries and mountain bike trails, which he wishes he had more time to visit. Don't we all? He's a 2004 graduate of UMBC with a BS in environmental science. And without further ado, here's Mark Stewart.
I'm not sure we have that on full screen, so let me just double check.
Okay, sure.
Can somebody tell me when I'm on the view?
Keep going, go left, one more, left.
Full screen. Do you see full screen? I can't read it from here.
Yeah, keep going down. Down. Stop.
There.
No,
Up one, or down one. There it is.
There you go.
All right, here's your controller, so you don't have to stand there staring at it. You can walk wherever you want.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm kind of overwhelmed by nostalgia. As soon as I walked onto campus, and it's been a while since I've been here, I was remembering some of the very hallways and ceiling tiles that I remember from my time here at the turn of the millennia. I had Dr. Miller as a professor more than 20 years ago, but great seeing you again. Yeah, I was a sort of kind of double major while I was here at UMBC. I was studying psychology and kept on just getting more and more interested in environmental issues. So I kept taking more and more geography classes. And then right when I was finishing up and I finished my BA in psychology, it was right at the time that this department was creating and launching its BS in environmental science. And I was like, wait a minute, I have almost all of the classes to complete that degree. And I re-enrolled in college. I came back. My advisors who I crossed paths with on campus were very confused to see me back on campus. And I took the last couple of classes to do a BS in environmental science, which I think maybe makes me the very first environmental science grad of UMBC. So that's kind of, a chip on my shoulder. I now run, thank you for that introduction. So I run the climate change program at the Maryland Department of the Environment. MDE, as you might be well aware, is the regulatory agency that oversees our policies to improve our air, water, and land for the state of Maryland, to protect human health and the health of all other species that we, cohabit this land with. My job is really focused on achieving the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So, the program that I lead, the climate change program, there's a whole lot that's packed into climate change, right? And a lot of focus on adaptation and resilience. We partner with other agencies, principally the Department of Natural Resources, to focus on adaptation and resilience measures for the state. But I just want to be clear that the plan that I'm going to talk about today and my main function is really focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right? So MDE and other agencies are engaged together in the broader conversation about, okay, how do we not just stop digging the hole that we're in, which is one way I think about GHG reduction, but also, how do we address all the adaptation and resilience measures that we really need to focus on? So we just released at the end of December Maryland's Climate Pollution Reduction Plan. And this plan meets several goals that were laid out in the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. So in that year, the Maryland General Assembly passed the nation's most ambitious GHG reduction law, or climate law, and it set in statute legal requirements for the state to achieve a 60% reduction in gross statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 2031. One little fun fact is that the law also required us to change to measuring methane and other greenhouse gases using a 20-year global warming potential instead of the standard, which is the 100-year. So this is way in the weeds, but I see a couple people nodding, so you might understand the implications. Not only do we have the most ambitious near-term goal of any state at a 60% reduction by 2031, but because we're measuring things on a 20-year basis, it's actually that much more challenging because some of the short-lived climate pollutants or more potent climate pollutants like methane are some of the more challenging actually to reduce because they're associated with landfills and waste systems that where we see less movement in emissions over time. So the law required that my program create this climate plan for the state by the end of 2023 to achieve principally that objective. This is meant to be the state's final plan to achieve its 2031 goal. It also has to set the state on a path to achieve its long-term goal, which is net zero statewide emissions by 2045. Also, if you're in the weeds on all this, just note the 60% goal is a gross emissions goal and the 2045 goal is a net emissions goal. So all of the great things that we're doing to grow more trees in the state and to think about carbon sequestration in our natural and working lands contributes toward our 2045 net emissions goal, but actually is not included in the 60% by 2031 goal. We also have, there are 3 pages of statute that dictate what all this plan has to do. But I'll just briefly say it also has to create net economic benefits and job growth for the state. So what we wound up with is a plan that has about 42 distinct policies. Some of those are current policies and some of those are new policies. And altogether, those policies add up to achieving significant emission reductions. So on the left side here, you see the current policy scenario, which would result in about a 51% reduction in statewide emissions by 2031, right? So 51 is a far departure from our 60% goal, but it's also, just to briefly acknowledge, federal policy plus state policy is already, as you can see on the left side, putting us on a pretty healthy trajectory of near-term emission reductions. Our challenge was to come up with the additional policies to achieve the 60% by 2031 goal, which is all the complicated graphing that you see on the right side there. And sorry, because I know that some of that's really tough to read, but basically what you have is you've got electricity sector emissions up top, commercial, residential, and industrial emissions. Those are direct fuel burn in buildings, essentially, as those tight dark blue, light blue, and teal colors. Industrial and product use in orange, the fossil fuel industry in gray, transportation, which is primarily on-road transportation, but we also include air travel and freight trains and everything else in our transportation emissions. And then waste management, agriculture, and then you have forestry and land use as a carbon sink in the state for the most part. So that's where we have all of our emissions coming together, and the modeling shows at least that we would achieve net zero emissions by 2045 with the important addition here of CO2 removal technologies, which is kind of our next foray into figuring out what that might look like for the state. Where I really want to start the story, though, is about the progress that we've already made so far. When I was growing up in Maryland in the 1980s, we had some of the worst air quality in the country. Maryland notoriously had the worst air quality in the entire eastern half of the United States. That is in large part due to the fact that we had 8 coal-fired power plants, very large coal-fired power plants in the state, as recently as 2006, right? I mean, this is even after my time here at UMBC. You know, we had a lot of coal power still burning here. We have 2 left today. Both of those power plants have announced plans to retire. So we're on a trajectory to move away from coal pretty quickly. But you know, it really significantly, just in 2022 was the very first year that Maryland achieved the national air quality standards since they were created by the Clean Air Act more than 50 years ago. So, you know, we've significantly improved our public health, our air quality across the state as we've reduced both criteria air pollutants and, as a co-benefit, you know, reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. The greatest area of improvement has been from the electricity sector. So, and again, that story that I just mentioned in terms of going from a large number of coal-fired power plants to cleaner sources of energy today is a big part of this piece, where we had in 2006 more than 40 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. These are the power plants that generate the electricity that's consumed statewide. These aren't just plants that are located in Maryland. These are also plants that are located outside of Maryland, because as you can see in the bottom part of this graph, the imported electricity, that's all of the electricity that we bring into the state from neighboring states. So Maryland, just about almost none of our states are in a perfect energy balance. You basically either have net electricity exporters or net electricity importers. And Maryland is a net importer. So we produce about half of the electricity, or a little bit more than half of the electricity that we use, and we import the rest, right? So we calculate the emissions associated with all of that. And you can see that the emissions from electricity use have really plummeted over the last couple of decades. And the current policy scenario has us bringing them down below 10 million metric tons annually, really just within the next few years. What we've done in this plan is modeled a couple of additional policies. One is that Maryland participates in a cap and invest program called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is a regional program where Maryland and a number of other mid-Atlantic and northeastern states require that their fossil fuel power plants reduce emissions over time. And we also require that those power plants purchase carbon allowances for all of the emissions they produce. That generates additional revenue for the state. Last year, that generated about $150 million that we were able to invest back in Maryland communities to develop more clean energy projects. What we are showing here is moving toward, on a regional basis, all of those power plants moving to zero emissions, I think by 2040. What we also layered in here is a new policy that Governor Moore is committed to see that within Maryland, we achieve 100% clean power by 2035, aligning with President Biden's goal for the nation. That policy, those policy specifics, we called it the Clean Power Standard in our plan. By the end of this year, we plan to release more details about what that policy will look like. MDE has a long history of looking at emissions from major sources, right? Power plants, industrial sources. Where we are really needing to pivot is focusing on policies on small sources, the millions of small sources that we have located across the state, including cars, trucks, furnaces, water heaters, boilers, right? All the typical stuff that we have burning in our basements and on our roads. That's where you see a large focus of our new plan. And really the objective is to electrify as much of that as possible. The Maryland is really fortunate in a number of ways in terms of this transition to a more electrified society. One is that already nationally, in 2022, I think it was, I probably wrote it on here. Yeah, in 2022, heat pumps started outselling gas furnaces nationally. Maryland is ahead of that. Out in Maryland, heat pumps have outsold furnaces for some time now. We are committing in our new plan for almost all new space heating equipment to be heat pumps starting later this decade. With electric vehicles, we had, last year, the Model Y was the #1 selling EV in the, or selling car, not only in the United States, but in the entire world. So we're starting to see that more rapid transition to electric vehicles. That said, there's a lot of development that's still needed to see that the people who choose to drive, who don't have the benefit of using mass transit and other VMT reduction options, are well supported to move toward EVs. One, there's a lot of equity issues. Most of what we focus on really is how do we make this an equitable transition to a more clean, to a clean energy future. And equity in EV adoption is a really major focus for us because almost everyone who owns an EV has a dedicated parking space, right? They've got a garage or a driveway where they know that they'll be able to plug in their car overnight and leave every day with a full tank. A lot of renters, people who are not living in a situation where they have dedicated parking, are understandably wary of making that transition, right? Where are they going to charge? Are there going to be enough fast chargers available to them? Those are real concerns, which is why our vehicle electrification policy is actually on a slower timescale than our heating system electrification policies. What we're planning to do is ramp up our heating system policies so that starting later this decade, we achieve 100% zero emissions standards for new heating systems. For vehicles, in terms of light duty vehicles, that's stretched out until 2035. So Maryland is among several other states that have adopted the California Advanced Clean Car 2 rule. So that it slowly ramps up so that by 2035, 100% of new light duty vehicles sold in Maryland will be zero emission vehicles, right? So we've got about a decade to achieve that transition based on our policy. There's been a lot of questions, and there was a lot of debate in the legislature when they were passing the Climate Solutions Now Act about the grid impacts of electrification. Can the grid handle all of these vehicles and all of these building heating loads moving to the electric system? So the Public Service Commission engaged a consultant called Brattle to do a deep study into this, and the answer, generally speaking, came back, yes, the grid can handle this transition. In fact, the additional growth that's needed on the grid is well below historic rates of growth for the electric system in general. So what we see is that electrification is a major driver of emissions reduction in the transportation sector, where we have the current policies scenario. That dotted orange line is really representing the impact of our Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule and Advanced Clean Trucks. So those are our two primary policies that say, okay, new vehicles are going to need to be increasingly electric, right? I say that they're part of our current policy scenario because those are policies that the state had already committed to before we released this plan. But you see that in basically the final policy scenario, we were able to drive the emissions a little bit lower than that. And that's really mostly thanks to additional commitments that the Maryland Department of Transportation has made to increase all of their measures, including like building new mass transit and offering better transit options that help reduce vehicle miles traveled. That's basically the amount of mileage that individual vehicles are putting on the roads each year, right? The MDOT's plan results in a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled by 2045, if I remember correctly. Maryland already has a fairly robust network of EV chargers, but thanks in large part to stimulus of federal funding, we're planning on significantly increasing this network, making it that much easier for people to find fast chargers. When you realize that battery technology is also rapidly evolving, I spent the last, well, I've been at MDE for the last 2.5 years. As Nick mentioned, I was at the University of Maryland, College Park for 14 years prior to that, leading sustainability and climate change programs there. The solid state battery technologies that are being developed by the Energy Research Center and other research centers around the world is really advanced stuff, and we're several years away from that being kind of the standard battery that's going to start being introduced into electric vehicles, which is going to significantly increase the energy density of batteries, basically longer ranges, and very, very importantly, increase fast charge times so that you get closer to the point, just like if you're filling up a gasoline powered car and you can expect to fill up your tank in 2 to 3 minutes at the pump. We're getting closer to those levels of fast charge speeds with some of the new solid state battery technologies that are coming out. We also see that, as I mentioned previously, the electrification of the building sector is a really key part of reducing fossil fuels in buildings, right? So the building sector is particularly stubborn. If you looked at just the section of this graph that shows 2006 until today, you basically see that emissions have been flat, except for 2014, which was a very cold winter. When you have deep cold snaps or prolonged cold weather throughout winter, you of course have more fuel use, more heating demand in buildings. So 2014 is that sort of anomalously cold winter right there that you see on the graph. But basically, when someone's water heater or furnace dies, they call up a contractor, and the contractor shows up sometimes same day and replaces that furnace or water heater with a new furnace or water heater. It's an in-kind replacement almost all the time. And too often when consumers, because they've been hearing about all these federal rebates for heat pumps and everything, when the consumers ask their contractor, oh, what about a heat pump? The contractor's response sometimes, because it's a longer, more challenging project, is, you don't want that, or we don't have time for that. So why don't we just, swap out this water heater today and, make sure you have a hot shower tonight. And at the end of the day, the consumer cares about having a hot shower much more than they do about that thing that they've heard the federal government's giving them money for. So transitioning the building sector is actually a real challenge, and we lock in emissions for a long time with each furnace replacement. That furnace is going to last likely 20 years before it needs to be replaced again, right? So we are committing in this plan to develop 2 new policies. One is called zero emission heating equipment standards, and the other is called clean heat standards. A zero emission heating equipment standard basically works probably the way that you think it does based on its title. It's a standard that says starting in some year, a new heating system that is installed needs to produce 0 emissions, right? So that will essentially and eventually prohibit the install of new fossil fuel based heating equipment. Clean heat standards are quite a bit more complicated, but basically you can think of it as being similar to another policy that we call a renewable portfolio standard, which requires increasing shares of renewable energy to be deployed on the grid. A clean heat standard works in a similar way, where it requires the fossil fuel heat providers, the natural gas utility companies and heating oil and propane distributors, to help their customers deploy increasing numbers of clean heat measures, like installing heat pumps, improving weatherization, insulation. So by requiring additional clean heat measures to be deployed, and by putting that requirement on the fossil fuel heating providers, we see in our modeling some pretty significant transition of the building sector. All these things add up to creating a lot of new jobs for Maryland. We estimate, and just so we're clear on who we is, so MDE contracted with the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, College Park, for our energy and emissions modeling. And we had the Regional Economic Studies Institute at Towson University as a subcontractor to focus on the economic and jobs impact analysis. So Resi at Towson found that implementing our plan will create an additional 27,000 jobs in Maryland between now and 2031. And that we expect a number of these additional jobs to be focused on trades like electricians and heat pump installers. We already have a critical shortage, by the way, of most trades. I actually just saw a study came out that showed that across the board, Maryland is, I don't know to call us number 1 or number 50 in the nation here, but basically we have the greatest labor shortage of any state in the nation. We have a lot of job opportunities. The problem is that our skill sets in the employment force aren't always aligned perfectly with the opportunities that are out there, right? And electricians and heat pump installers are sort of examples of that. We also see that there's household energy savings, and this wasn't even based on the future modeling, which does show, by the way, that natural gas rates will increase faster than electricity rates. But just looking at today, a household that uses gas-powered cars and has natural gas heating at home, when that same household transitions to being all electric, drives, using EVs and heating with heat pumps, they're saving about $2,600 each year from that transition. The savings are really amplified for the homes that are on heating oil and propane, and especially heating oil. A household in Maryland that uses heating oil is spending about $2,000 more each winter than a house that's heated by heat pumps or natural gas. So that's a significant cost. And heating oil also happens to be the dirtiest form of the heating fuels that are traditionally used within buildings. So a really keen focus is helping to get customers off of heating oil to save thousands of dollars per year and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other criteria pollutants. We see that the savings, once you look at that all electric conversion, helping them get into EVs as well, it's about $4,000 a year in total. The federal government is here in a big way to help thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. You can get a 30% tax credit on a number of things, including home energy audits, zero emission appliances, solar panels, insulation, weatherization packages. The federal government's offering up to $7,500, which is now starting this year available as an upfront point of sale rebate to buy an electric vehicle. There's also a $4,000 credit for buying a used EV that, as long as that used EV meets a couple of criteria, including being less than $25,000 to purchase. The state is currently offering, although this is, so let me get this out and then I'll dive into a caveat here. The state is currently offering $3,000 to help you buy a new electric vehicle if the base purchase price of that electric vehicle is $50,000 or less, but don't run out today to go buy that electric vehicle to get that $3,000 from the state, because we've probably just about run out of money in that fund for this fiscal year. So wait until July 1st, because that's when that fund will be renewed. And starting July 1st and running until it runs out, there'll be another $3,000 per year authorized to help people, Marylanders, buy new electric vehicles. The Inflation Reduction Act is also offering rebates for low income, moderate income, and some middle income households. The fine details of this are still being really mapped out. The DOE is in the process right now of approving the state's plans. So the Maryland Energy Administration will be administering this program to provide rebates, including a rebate of up to $8,000 to help you install a heat pump at your house. Important to note about these rebates that they will also be available essentially to renters. They're accessible to landlords also to install this equipment, so it's not just for homeowners. But the details on Maryland's plan are expected to be released soon, with the program starting up in the second half of this year. So our plan is looking at a lot of new investment that's needed across society to achieve these goals that the state has. And what our plan did is look at different pots of money, different funding sources that the state could tap into to help achieve some of these things. So obviously, we're looking very closely at federal grants. Where my program's in the process of applying for more than $100 million right now from the EPA to help with building decarbonization initiatives. But we're looking at some other things too, right? Like a cap and invest program. I mentioned that we are currently doing a cap and invest program just for power plants. One concept that we've been chewing on is expanding, basically developing a broader cap and invest program that would cover other sources like the oil and gas industry. There's other ideas that have been floated and are in the General Assembly actually right now, including carbon fees. The basic difference between cap and invest and a carbon fee: in cap and invest, the government says that all of these covered sources of emissions need to stay under a cap. They need to reduce emissions over time, and that the price that they need to pay for all their emissions is set by the market. There's a market-based mechanism that sets the carbon price. That's a little bit different from a carbon fee or carbon tax approach, where basically the government sets the carbon price and there's no cap associated. It just says we're gonna price carbon. The price is going to be at this, and the assumption is that a carbon fee would reduce emissions because consumers are now accounting for that additional cost. Some questions about how much consumers actually respond to carbon price signals. A hazardous substance fee is another idea that was floated in our plan. There's several other states, and actually in some ways, including Maryland, that assess a fee on hazardous substances, including fossil fuels that are just transported within a state, right? One fee that we have in Maryland that is an example of this is called the oil transfer fee. So all petroleum products are already paying a fee that goes primarily into our oil spill prevention fund. So if there's a tanker truck that tips over on 95 and our hazmat team needs to go out and do a cleanup and a soil remediation, all of it, basically the petroleum distributors are already paying into a program that helps MDE do those cleanups around the state. The idea that we floated in the plan is to expand that to fuels and hazardous substances that are not currently covered, including potentially coal and natural gas. And then there's fees on fuel burning vehicles. So one thing that is very actively debated and is possibly going to be a bill that gets some traction this year in the General Assembly is the idea of increasing registration fees on EVs. So the story here, if you haven't already connected these dots, is that people who drive gas-powered cars buy gasoline, and there's a state tax on gasoline, which goes into the Transportation Trust Fund, which means that the state can use the gas tax revenue to make improvements to the roads and bridges and all the transportation infrastructure of the state. EV drivers are using the roads and bridges and all of the transportation infrastructure, but they're not paying for any of it because they're not paying for gas. There's no gas tax assessment. So one idea that the General Assembly is chewing on right now is doing what several other states have done, which is to increase the registration fee on EVs so that that registration fee is going into the Transportation Trust Fund to pay for the road improvements that are needed as people drive on roads. What we said in the climate plan is if registration rates increase for EV owners, there should be a comparable increase in registration rates for the owners of fuel burning vehicles so that that registration rate increase can help fund all of these climate initiatives. You can feel free to love or hate and tell me if you love or hate any of these policies, by the way. With all these new investments, the state plans to focus on these key areas: building electrification, transitioning to electric vehicles, industrial decarbonization, workforce development, and some others that were included in the plan. One quick note is that one thing you might be like, wait a minute, what about mass transit and all those important VMT reduction strategies? That is also a key part of the state's overall strategy, of course, but in MDE's plan, this is a little bit weird, but MDE's plan basically focuses on all of the policies except for MDOT's transportation infrastructure plan and policies. So any costs associated with improving mass transit and otherwise reducing VMT in the state is really outside of our plan and is embodied in MDOT's plan. So sorry that we weren't able to roll it all together. But we're calling for an additional $1 billion a year in public investment in making this transition. And I really want to emphasize that that's an investment, right? This is an investment that is not, you know, a lot of people are asking us, whoa, wait, why are we going to spend $1 billion? Why are we going to spend $1 billion? Because that $1 billion is also going to help us help homeowners and renters save thousands of dollars a year on their energy costs. It's going to create 27,000 new jobs. It's going to increase total personal income across the state by $2.5 billion by 2031. It's going to increase Maryland's gross domestic product by more than $5 billion. What we see across the board in every of the economic categories that we examined was a net benefit by 2031. And oh yeah, by the way, we're also keeping Earth habitable for ourselves and future generations while we're working on it. So there's that too, if you're not just a penny pincher. When we drill into the health benefits, we see that the health benefits are concentrated in the communities that have been historically disadvantaged by poor air quality. Some of the greatest improvements happen in Prince George's County, in Baltimore City, Baltimore County. So that's just another very important kind of co-benefit of these policies and improving air quality as we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when we look on the global scale, for those who remember what this is all about, we see in economic terms that the more than 600 million metric tons of CO2 that is reduced just by our new policies, ignoring the existing policies, has a global economic benefit estimated to be $135 billion for the world by 2050. So it does add up, despite the fact that people like to point out that Maryland's a small state. I would point out that Maryland has, we're one of the most populous states in the country, and we have, you know, a whole lot going for us despite our small geographical size. So some of our next steps, we're currently evaluating or trying to maximize our federal funding opportunities and applying for a lot of grants. We are implementing new rulemaking processes. We just launched our rulemaking to develop zero emission heating equipment standards and clean heat standards. Those reside within my program. Coordinating with the Maryland Commission on Climate Change to continue considering what's the right funding mechanism for Maryland, right? There's some big considerations there. And we're doing some work to continue to evaluate those big funding mechanisms. Feel free to reach out to us and of course, like and follow MDE on your favorite social media platform. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments or complaints that you might have about anything that I mentioned.
So just to let people know, there's a class that's coming in here at 1. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, I think, before we have to worry about people coming in and trying to push us out. So with that.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. I think we're going to get to have lunch together so I can talk with you more then. Cool. But there's something that I don't want to come off as obnoxious. And I hear you about MDOT having the separate plan as addressing vehicle miles traveled. I can't help but ask though, so people who are buying EVs are getting incentives for that. Has there been any modeling about incentives to get people to actually take public transit. Would that fit under MDE or would it be more under MDOT?
So in terms of an agency taking on that modeling, it would be under MDOT, and they have consultants looking at a whole lot in terms of their VMT reduction strategy, and I could find out if that particular question is on their consultants list. But I can also tell you that, I facilitate the greenhouse gas emissions mitigation working group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. That group spent most of its last year thinking about modifications it wants to make to the EV incentives program of the state. And I mentioned it earlier. We're already running out of money for this fiscal year for that program. So one just surface level issue is we need to think about the funding, total amount of funding in that program. But the Climate Commission, just so you know, and we integrated into the plan, also recommended that the state pivot to providing those EV incentives as being greater levels of incentive for lower and moderate income households. So there's a whole equity component. Anyhow, that working group and the Climate Commission spent a lot of time on EV incentives last year. Really throughout hearing the complaint, we're spending entirely too much time on EVs and not nearly enough time on all of the rest of it in the transportation sector. So this year, and we made this commitment last year, this year the Climate Commission is really doing a heavy focus on the VMT reduction strategies. And we're actually right now trying to sort of scope that out to figure out, what studies we're going to do and what speakers we're going to pull into that process.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I wrote down 4 questions, so I'm going to choose one. I wanted to know where waste management, waste incineration, and landfill generated emissions fit in your reduction plan and regulatory.
Yep. So let me go way back because I don't think I put specifically our waste. If you opened up our plan, you would see.
Waste management.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter on. Yeah, there's a whole chapter on waste management with specific projections on where waste management emissions are going in our plan. But yeah, that pink section at the very bottom is waste management. And some of our policies in the space include new methane regulations that require landfills of certain sizes in Maryland to capture and utilize or flare their methane. We included in the plan that for waste incineration, it should not count as a renewable energy source. So our plan calls for removing incineration from the state's RPS program. Yeah, which is about as much as I can say about that because there's a bill on that right now in the legislature. Just part of the fun of working in government is when you're at an agency, you say nothing about the legislative session. So that's all I have to say about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks to Maggie for asking my first question. So now I get to ask my second question. That's you want to have some miles travel reduction. How do you plan to achieve that if you do not encourage public transportation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So some of that is looking at the big infrastructure projects like the Purple Line and the Red Line that MDOT is committing despite some recent budget cuts that MDOT has announced. It was, I think in November or December, MDOT announced a $3 billion reduction for this fiscal year. And yet with that, they maintain their commitment to continue their work on the Purple Line, on the Red Line, and other VMT, other mass transit and VMT reduction strategies. That said, one of the impacts of that budget reduction was a reduction in service, their existing service, and especially bus service. So Governor Moore gave a bit of a stimulus toward that to bring some of those services back. But one of the big reasons why Annapolis is very focused on transportation funding this year is to really bolster and make sure that all of these services are, as strong as they need to be to achieve our equity goals, our housing goals, our climate goals. There's a lot wrapped up, of course, in transportation funding and policy. But I mean, we have big goals as a state, including an entire education reform package called the Blueprint for Education. And the state is looking at some very sobering fiscal realities of funding all of these things. It's a big thing our lawmakers are working on right now. Yep.
So I'm going to build off the last couple of questions. Thanks so much for your talk. It's really exciting to see these aggressive goals. One of the critiques around EV credits is that they subsidize suburban development. Baltimore region, what that tends to do is reinforce higher taxes in Baltimore City, surrounding counties. And I did actually look at the MDOT's plan. It's pretty pathetic. So is there, like, where's the opportunity for NBE to play a stronger role with MDOT? And how do we kind of connect or disconnect EVs and suburban development so that we're not actually having to think about spending money on all these instead of just those.
I don't know how much additional leverage MDE can get in that conversation with MDOT, but I think that that you all as constituents in the state and with your relationships with your lawmakers have a lot of influence over the plans that MDOT and the Department of Planning put together to really focus on all these planning and zoning issues, the transportation issues. There's a lot of debate right now about, housing policy and smart growth, and a lot of it, which is not, of course, solely within the jurisdiction of MDE. So we do have the opportunity through the state's climate commission to kind of, the climate commission has the Secretary of Planning and the Secretary of Transportation and the Secretary of the Environment, among other cabinet members, on it to focus on climate issues. I think one of the challenges is that when you get into the issues that you just mentioned, it's not just, of course, it's not just climate. And it's part of the great thing about the Climate Commission being as diverse it is this opportunity to talk about climate as it relates to all these other things. But we've got a challenge in figuring out how to, connect the dots in the best way between, housing policy, zoning rules, climate, and it's not easy in frankly, in any organization, including government, that has a lot of, turnover.
Yeah, can I ask another question?
Well, I think, so we have time for one more short question, and if you want to join us at lunch, please do. But we have a couple of students, I think, have their hands raised. So one more short question, because we're going to have to stop after that with people in the room.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving the talk. I don't know if this was mentioned in the presentation or was just kind of mixed in, but I'm curious as to the part where, like this diagram showing the net zero emissions, the forestry and land use, I'm guessing is a majority like planting trees and they sequester the CO2 is kind of where you factor. The CO2 removal, the other factors you're doing, just curious.
Yeah, I'd say the CO2 removal part on this graph is driven by the modeling that was done by our consultant, less so than like a policy decision from the state. Which is to say that the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland has this massive model that looks at the most cost-effective way to achieve certain GHG reduction goals. And in their model, what they found was that for Maryland to achieve net zero emissions by 2045, the model built out a significant amount of CO2 removal technology, starting, sometime maybe in the next decade or so, because the model says that's the lowest cost, that's going to be the lowest cost solution for the state to meet those goals. That's an area like, of all of the uncertainties that are baked in throughout all of this, I think the CO2 removal piece is one where we need to think a lot more and do more work before, committing to that necessarily being like the best solution to achieve net zero emissions, right? But that was a result of the modeling that was done.
I'm going to ask everybody to thank our speaker. I'll just say there are 4 of us going to lunch. If 1 or 2 people want to join us, we're going over to the Skylight Room. Also, Dana Stein is Speaker Pro Tem of the House. Happens to be my delegate as well. He's the guy that's responsible for a lot of this in terms of work in the legislature. So if you want to talk to him about transportation, he'll listen. Thanks a lot.
Oh,
Stop the recording.
and we're gonna be hiring soon. So this spring, if you're looking for jobs, we're gonna be hiring a bunch of policy analysts in my group. So
Oh, send.
okay.
Thanks, everybody online. We're going to stop the recording now and then end the session.